In this module we will discuss EAV entities, models and resources, loading from flat tables versus the EAV load process, and the EAV save process. An EAV entity is an entity type that is persisted using the EAV database schema via the EAV resource model. This diagram demonstrates that EAV-based entity models also extend from Magento Framework Model Abstract Model. EAV-based resource models, on the other hand, extend Magento EAV Model Entity Abstract Entity rather than Magento Framework Model Resource DB Abstract. The EAV resource model implements additional methods beyond those used in the abstract flat table resource model. These include getAttribute. GetAttribute allows you to get an attribute instance by code or numeric ID. For example, product, getResource, getAttribute, color. SaveAttribute. SaveAttribute allows you to save an attribute value on an entity without going through the full entity save process. Here's an example. Product setWeight, getResource SaveAttribute. GetWrite connection. In addition to the getRead connection method that also exists on flat table resource models, EAV resource models have an interface method to access the write adapter. GetEntityTable. In contrast to the getMainTable method of flat table resource models, EAV resource models implement the getEntityTable method instead. There is no difference in declaring EAV-based entity models compared to declaring flat table-based models. The init method is called with the class name of the resource model. On the other hand, declaring an EAV-based resource model differs from declaring a flat table-based resource model. Instead of initializing the resource model with the main table name and the primary key column, EAV resource models are initialized with the entity type code and the names of the DB read and write resources to use. All additional information, for example the entity table name, is read from the EAV meta table EAV entity type. This diagram shows the schematic of the flat table load process. This diagram depicts the EAV load process. Recall that there are two aspects to the EAV process: managing the relationships, that is, the meta information about entities and attributes, and managing the content, that is, the entities and attribute value records. The two load steps on the slide labeled with first are related to the meta aspects of EAV. The two steps labeled with second refer to the concrete attribute values. During the loading of EAV entities, the meta information is read first. This includes the attribute labels and the backend types, as well as the information which attributes to include in the load process. Then the accomplishing attribute values are read from the value tables and set on the entity model, combined with the attribute codes from the meta information. The code example demonstrates how Magento gets the list of entity attributes with a store view label for a given attribute set. In this query, you can see how Magento implements store view scope values with a fallback to the default scope using SQL. The attribute codes will be combined with the attribute values to populate an entity with data. The first query loads the static attribute values from the entity table. This is the simplest query during the EAV load process. It simply selects all the values from a specific entity from the entity table, in effect loading the attributes with a static backend type. The second query loads the attribute values for one entity. Selecting all attribute values from the entity value tables for a full entity load is done using union selects. This is much faster than joins and is possible because all the attribute value tables have an identical structure, except for the data type of the value column. The attribute values will be combined with the attribute code and set on the entity models to populate them. For select or multi-select attributes, Magento 2 uses the table source model. This source model loads the option IDs and option values from the tables EAV attribute option and EAV attribute option value. The store view specific option values are fetched via a left join on the value table if there is a store view specific value, otherwise it uses the default value for the store ID 0. This diagram shows the table structure of the EAV options, which is queried using the SQL shown on the previous slide. The values stored on the entities are the option IDs from the EAV attribute option table. For select attributes, the value is stored in the integer attribute value table. For multi-select, it is stored as a comma-separated list of IDs in a varchar attribute value table. There are several methods on EAV collections you can call to influence the load process. Add attribute to select adds the attribute value table to the select and the attribute value to the result. Add attribute to filter joins the attribute table specific for this attribute and adds the filter condition. And join attribute joins the value table from the attribute from another entity. Static attributes are loaded from the entity table using a simple select query. When an attribute has been added to an EAV collection via add attribute to select, the attribute's backend type value table is added to the select using an union select. Catalog EAV entities with a store scope value will left join the attribute value table to fetch the store views value if it exists. Note: adding more attributes with the same backend type will use the same value table. This is the continuation of the code examples from the previous slide. Compared to the flat table save process, EAV adds one additional layer with before save and after save method calls, which is the attribute backend model. All attribute values are saved in the table according to their backend type property. Attribute backend models can be used to do the following and more: preparing values for storage in the database, as shown in the code example, setting default values, validation, and rehydration after loading. The backend model of the price attribute saves the attribute value for different store views if they have different currencies in the backend model's after save method. Note: the code example shows a slightly abbreviated version of the real method. When you need to load or save an EAV attribute value from any place, you can get the appropriate table by calling getTable on the attribute backend model. For example, product getResource getAttribute with attribute code getBackend getTable will tell you in which table that attribute was stored. Most native Magento select and multi-select attributes use the attribute source model, Magento EAV model entity attribute source table. The value stored with the entity in the attribute value table is the option ID. The human readable option label is stored in the EAV attribute option value table mapped by the EAV attribute option table. To get the option label from an option ID, use the associated attribute source model. EAV entity, for example, that would be a product or a customer, and then get resource, get attribute with the attribute code, get source, get option text, and then the option ID. The other way around, to get the option ID for a given option label, you can use EAV entity, get resource, get attribute, and then get source with the get option value method. Retrieving the option label for a product is easy. You simply call product get attribute text with the attribute code. This module on EAV attribute management discusses the practical application of the EAV concepts in Magento 2. In this module, we will discuss creating and customizing attributes. Managing attributes is about customizing attribute properties that define the runtime behavior. Each attribute may have some additional entity type specific properties which would be stored in additional tables, such as catalog EAV attribute. First, the attribute ID, the unique ID from the EAV attribute table. The entity type ID of the associated entity type. The attribute code. The attribute code must be unique within the associated entity type. The attribute model is the optional alternative model to use. It defaults to Magento EAV model entity attribute if not specified. The backend model is the optional alternative backend model. It defaults to Magento EAV model entity attribute backend default backend if not specified. The backend type is the data type for the attribute. Usually it's one of static, varchar, datetime, int, text, or decimal. Custom types are possible too. The backend table, it's an optional value for the table, which defaults to the entity table name with the backend type appended to it, separated by an underscore. The frontend model is the optional alternative frontend model. It defaults to Magento EAV model entity attribute frontend default frontend if not specified. The frontend input is the input type for the attribute if the admin HTML form is rendered automatically. Frontend label is the default label if the admin HTML form is rendered automatically. The frontend class is an optional CSS class name which will be added to the admin HTML input element if the admin HTML form is rendered automatically. This is useful for JavaScript validation. IsRequired enables JavaScript validation if the admin HTML form is rendered automatically. It is evaluated during data flow and import-export processes also. And finally, the default value is the optional default value for the attribute. It is displayed by the front-end model if the attribute has no value on an entity. Again, recall that there are two aspects to the EAV process: managing relationships and managing content. Information about the meta aspect of the EAV system can be accessed using the EAV config model, Magento EAV model config. It aggregates access to the meta information about entity types and attributes. There are a couple of generic EAV classes that you can use to get information. One of these is Magento EAV model config, which was mentioned on the previous slide. It is a very useful class for getting meta information. Accessing the EAV entity type and attribute models is easy. The method getAttribute on Magento EAV model config returns an attribute instance. It takes the entity type and the attribute code as arguments. The method getEntityType takes the entity type code and returns an entity type instance. The Magento EAV system offers the listed backend type variations by default. Custom types can be used as needed too. There is also the static attribute backend type, which indicates that the attribute values are stored in the entity table. The EAV setup class, Magento EAV setup, must be used to work with the attributes and entity types in module setup scripts. For this reason, it is a very important class. The EAV setup class implements methods for manipulating entity types and attributes. It is used by the install data or upgrade data setup classes of modules to add or modify EAV entities or attributes. Two examples of the methods that the setup class implements are addAttribute and updateAttribute. Note, the updateAttribute method property argument exactly matches the column name in the database, while for addAttribute, the property names of the data array are filtered through Magento EAV model entity setup property mapper interface map by the setup class. For example, addAttribute uses label instead of frontend_label. This mapping is defined in the mapper implementation Magento EAV Model Entity Setup Property Mapper. A list of add attribute property names. To accommodate additional attribute table column mappings, a composite property mapper is used, Magento EAV Model Entity Setup Property Mapper Composite, which is configured using the IXML. For example, in the Mage catalog .ixml file, the catalog property mapper is added to the composite. Here is a code sample of adding an attribute to a product. Note: properties do not have to be specified in the input array if the default values are sufficient. A reminder of the functions of attribute backend, source, and frontend models. Backend models provide hooks before and after save, load, and delete operations with an attribute value. Source models provide option values and labels for select and multi-select attributes. Front-end models prepare an attribute value for rendering on the front end. Backend models can be an alternative to an observer or a plugin, for example, when you have to do something that depends on an attribute value when an entity is saved. Magento comes with a number of backend models that can be used for custom attributes as well. The models can be found in the directory app code Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute Backend. Magento comes with a number of attribute source models that can be used for custom attributes too. The models can be found in the directory app code Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute Source. The number of front-end models Magento provides out of the box is very limited. These models can be found in the directory app code Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute Frontend. If an EAV entity type has an attribute with the attribute code increment_id and no backend model is set for that attribute, the Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute Backend Increment model is assigned automatically. All the increment attribute backend model does is call this getAttribute getEntity setNewIncrementID and passes in the object being saved. Note: see Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute getDefault Backend Model for more automatic assignment of backend models. By default, Magento 2 uses only the numeric increment model for customers, orders, shipments, invoices, and credit memos. The increment models shipped with Magento 2 out of the box can be found in the directory app code Magento EAV Model Entity Attribute Increment. After the entity type model's fetchNewIncrementID method is called, it delegates to the increment model to actually generate the new increment ID. The increment model to use is set on the entity type. Currently in Magento 2, all entities that use increments use the numeric increment model. Increments are saved in the EAV entity store table, one record for each entity type and store. The values from the EAV entity store table, together with the increment configuration stored in the EAV entity type table, are set on the increment models so they may be used to generate a new increment ID. The fetchNewIncrementID method is implemented on the entity type model Magento EAV Model Entity Type. It instantiates the increment model associated with the entity type and then sets the increment-related values from the EAV entity type table and the associated values from the EAV entity store table on the model. The new increment ID is generated by calling getNextID on the increment instance. See a course exercise guide for instructions on how to complete this exercise and its solution.